Thank you, everybody, for coming to this session on cultural inclusivity. It's a Thursday at UNM. It is spring break, and it's really quiet over here. So I'm not sure how it is where you are, but thanks for coming. So today in our session, we have three other folks besides me who are going to present on this topic. Olivia Baca is an assistant professor in graduate and faculty engagement. And I am the OER librarian. I'm Jennifer Jordan. Jonathan Wheeler is an associate professor, and then the coordinator for graduate and faculty engagement. And then we have also Sammi Williams here, who is our OER program coordinator. So today we're going to talk about why cultural inclusivity. Olivia has a presentation on the history of multicultural education. I'm going to present some OER and social justice research, and then some frameworks for evaluating OER. John is going to talk about discovering culturally responsive OER materials. And then Sammi is also in here to talk about one of our specific slides. And then we're also going to talk about open pedagogy and inclusivity. So first off, why do this now? A lot of times when you hear about the benefits of open educational resources, the focus is on how it provides cost savings for students. And so that's really important, definitely. But there's other aspects of using OER that are important for student success. And so that's what this, one of those, I guess, benefits is what we're going to cover in this session. And then also it's super important for students is that sense of belonging in the classroom. And so OER can do that in a couple of different ways. The fact that it's free and that all students have access can make a student feel more included in what's happening in the classroom. But then also there's ways that you can adapt OER for your specific student populations to make them feel included. And that's some of what we're going to talk about today. And then also, in past sessions, we've talked about universal design in our previous workshop sessions. But we can also think about cultural inclusivity as part of our approach to universal design, because universal design is the design of products and environments that are usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for them to adapt it or use any other specialized design to use it and benefit from it. And then cultural inclusivity, add that to the mix. It includes recognizing, understanding, and respecting differences in cultural backgrounds, values, beliefs, and practices, and helps to create an environment that encourages meaningful participation from people of all backgrounds. So those are just some of the reasons why we are addressing this topic during this session of our OER workshop series for the spring of 2025. So in here we have a poll from John. So y'all can use this QR code to get to the poll, and then I'm going to try to open it also.
Yeah, it is up and running.
So John made this wonderful poll. Here's the link. So how do you think learners benefit from the use of culturally inclusive materials? And you can just enter some words. And I also think there's other ways too that learners can benefit from the use of culturally inclusive materials. Critical thinking, that is super important to our students. Thinking critically about the material, the content that they're accessing. And then feeling empowered to join, feeling safe in the classroom, which is super important. I think, like from my pedagogical approach, just to get students, when they feel included, they contribute more. So thanks.
And Jennifer, we had a follow-up. If I can go ahead and switch, if you want to go ahead and do that, was
Yes.
brainstorming on how we create a sense of belonging for learners.
Include projects and content that are relevant to their culture, experience, and community. Include them in the conversation. I think also like allowing them to choose topics can help them to feel included to like with research projects and stuff. So awesome. Thank you. Thanks everybody for answering these slides. So I'm gonna hand it off to Olivia, who's gonna talk about multicultural education.
Thank you, Jennifer. And if you will please advance the slides, not just yet, but when I ask you to. Little tricky wordplay there, but everyone, I'm going to do a couple things today. I'm just going to talk about different definitions that are prominent when we hear multicultural education, and part of my thought there is just to sort of help tease out some of the nuance of this very large concept, and then very quickly step through some chronology of multicultural education in the US in about the last 75 years. Okay, so next slide, please, Jennifer. So I'm taking these next two slides, will talk about some different definitions that come from this 2019 book by Brandy Hinnett Crawford called Comprehensive Multicultural Education in the 21st Century. And the bolding on these definitions is mine, but I thought that in composition together, I think they really help flesh out some of the key pieces when we talk about multicultural education. So in 2000, Nieto is talking about this primary purpose as being confronting issues of power and privilege in society, and the political aspect of this endeavor, right, to introduce equity and further social justice, which is something Jennifer will talk about more later, I think is an ongoing pattern. In 2016, Grant is talking about it really more, sort of framing it as a philosophical concept, so less about the need for action, but also grounding that concept in these principles, again, of social justice, equity, valuing diversity. And so if we move on to the next slide, please, we can see that two more scholars, again, are pretty consistent. I don't think Gorski is saying anything that we didn't see in the first slide, or at least it's consistent with it. I think he's got some more nuance there that we don't have time to go into at the moment. But again, sort of this vision of even if you're not all doing identical things, the core of multicultural education is about this sense of progress. And then with Banks and Banks, I added the word relational because it just really seemed like, knowledge, attitudes, and skills are things that we often see in like job postings. And the idea that their definition is those things in service of microcultures of one's own, along with macro, micro, and global cultures beyond, our local setting, felt like again, maybe one of the key threads of this concept that we want to hold on to as we extend it into developing materials. So if we go on to the next slide, there is a National Association for Multicultural Education, and they have a page-long discussion of what this means. And so I chose to add two slides to, again, sort of hopefully enrich this idea of what this means. And so if we go back to that Banks and Banks idea of relationality, here we see interdependent world, right? And I'm sorry, we can stay on that slide 12, but just really that sense of connection, I think, struck me. And I think this, again, this idea of explicitly valuing difference is something that has emerged, right, in the last 100 years or so. So if we go on to the next slide, number 13, I think for practitioners, right, this this top bullet felt really important because it is talking about centering the students. And I think sometimes when we talk about valuing difference, that can feel a little bit abstract, but I really appreciated that the way that they expressed it here has to do with connecting what we are nurturing with a direct line to the students and facilitating their learning. So we go on to number 14. Now we'll shift into this very brief race through a time history, but just sort of thinking about like, how have we come to where we are now? And in 1954, there was a Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, that determined that segregated schooling was unconstitutional. And so this comes out of the beginning of the civil rights movement, which of course continued past the 50s and into the 60s. So again, if we think about where we are now in terms of a timeline, about 75 years ago, we see this momentum shift, right? And a real change in the country to try to offer or move toward equity, maybe would be a way of saying it, in terms of offering public education to all people, to all students, regardless of race. At this time, we also see education scholars talking about things like the GI Bill, and I'm going to cheat and look at my notes for a moment, but as a way to complete the transition to a deliberative democracy. So some of what we'll see is like a real parallel between proponents of multicultural education and the same kinds of strategies and values supporting citizen education and literacy. So that's something that we see emerging about the middle of the 20th century. And then if we move on to number 15, in the 70s and the 80s, we see a lot of push and pull. So because of the court decision we were just talking about, right, segregation is no longer allowed by the letter of the law. In the spirit of the law, we see a lot of white flight in urban locations. And so white families move to the suburbs increasingly to avoid having to accommodate, right, this legal ruling that they may not agree with. For students who are immigrants, however, we do see some progress again. There was a 1982 ruling called Plyer v. Doe, where the Supreme Court upheld the educational right of immigrant students. So at the same time, right, that we're seeing kind of an avoidance of confronting a plurality of cultures, we are seeing inroads in a legal and judicial setting. And then with special education, the dates don't perfectly align with my slides. So in 1975, Congress passed a public law called Education for All Handicapped Children, and that was an act. It got updated in 1990, and they changed language there. So that's the first time in legal settings in the US at the federal level that the term was switched from handicap to disabilities. But in 1990, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed, and it extended some of what the 1975 Act had codified. And so again, just at sort of this big picture level, thinking about how we moved through time, and with the civil rights, most of the focus was on race and ethnicity. And as we move forward, those issues don't get resolved or less complicated, but we're also starting to see additional facets of identity, like immigration, like needs of disabled students, come into focus. And so then if we move on to the 90s and 2000s on the next slide, some of the literature that I looked at really noted that this is the time at which the idea of not asking students who might not be part of the majority to assimilate, but to celebrate the diversity that they bring to the group as like a conceptual way of approaching this in the classroom. And yet again, we get that push-pull of, with the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001, even though it was intended to focus on sort of bringing up the most vulnerable children, the practical implications of its rigidity meant that most teachers had to focus on teaching to the test and lost a lot of flexibility that they had to respond to the local needs of their classroom and the students therein. Just a final note on this slide has to do with, enacting. I think I put grappling here because the literature seemed to sort of recognize that, like, okay, we have this vision of what we want to be doing, but in practice, enacting that can be challenging when the majority of K-12 teachers demographically tend to be middle-class white women who may not have the background or exposure to more diverse cultures except for the students that they find in their classrooms, and thinking about what is needed to do that in a responsible and appropriate way. So if we move on to the next slide, please, I think this will round it out. Originally, I'd hoped to have like a big, and this all means, and then I got a little, it was hard to find an absolute meaning of what we see when we look at all of this. But I do think that if we come to more current times, we can see that tension of progress and backlash continues, right? We see that with the backlash against DEI. Social emotional learning really emerged, I think, in the 90s. And in the early aughts, they had real success starting to document its outcomes. That's continued in the last 15 years. And even though that's not quite, I would say maybe it's adjacent to multicultural education, it stood out to me as an approach that really asks educators to meet students where they are as like whole people. And so I think that in its own way also furthers the efforts of multicultural education writ large. And then finally, I just wanted to mention briefly the Dismantling Whiteness publication from 2013. Let me grab that quote. So in her abstract, she says, "My data highlight how teachers' understandings of multicultural education vacillate between what I call power-blind sameness and color-blind difference. In the end, I suggest that our everyday engagements with power-blind sameness and colorblind difference protect whiteness, but also that whiteness prevents us from working toward equity, justice, and democracy." So I don't have a pat answer about, what to take away from that, but I do think it's an interesting complication of this big idea that we've seen, gain popularity in the past few generations. Okay, that's my piece. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Olivia. That was amazing. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about research having to do with OER and then some evaluation criteria. So if you're interested in learning more about like different ways you can work on OER, revise OER, and do it through like a lens of other people's research or other people's frameworks, like these next slides go over that. And so kind of like bouncing off from where Olivia left off from, a socially just open education is committed to ensuring scholars and students from marginalized communities and backgrounds are better represented in the curriculum and in the knowledge creation process. A socially just open education also asks for us to interrogate unjust practices and procedures in open education. It has a human-centered approach, and then creates products that truly meet the needs of its users, doesn't always prioritize the global north as well. And so we can think about going open as a choice. Licensing helps to affirm that open is founded on a choice of faculty. People are choosing to share their work. And then also you can include cultural considerations as you're deciding to openly license and share your work or adapt other people's work as well. This is an article by Sarah Lambert, and a lot of folks use this in their like articles, it's referenced a lot when people are talking about OER. Like I had mentioned earlier, initially when people started doing research into the effects of OER, a lot of the research was focusing on cost. And so Sarah Lambert published this article in 2018, and she challenged researchers to look at other aspects of OER and other, benefits of OER beyond like saving students money. Um, so she defines open education by aligning it with the social justice to provide a theoretical framework for equitable education. She redefines OER as a process and a goal to achieve a fairer society, which involves actions guided by the principles of redistributive justice, recognitive justice, or representational justice. And then she developed her stance based on the work of John Rawls, Nancy Fraser, and Amanda Ketty, and also Iris Marion Young. So this definition of social justice, redistributive, recognitive, and representational, it can be used as a framework as you're creating, allocating, designing OER materials. So you can think about achieving these aspects of social justice, like redistributive justice can be achieved by allocating resources toward those who have less. So that would be like, the cost savings aspect of creating OER. But there's these other ways that we can like work on OER to make them even more like socially just. So for example, if you're including recognitive justice as you're adapting or creating materials, you can do that through respecting like cultural and gender differences within OER materials. Representational justice can be achieved through equitable representation of marginalized voices as creators. And so Lambert says we need all three prongs of social justice to make OER creation programs responsive and equitable. I know when I started doing OER research and creation like 10 years ago, I was an English teacher, and a lot of the OER that was out there was like kind of racist and sexist. So part of the job of revising it was going through and just trying to make it seem like it wasn't written for like people who were just writing standard American English, and adapting it for the students that we were serving when I was working at C&M. And so that was like an important part of the adaptation process because we wanted students to be able to relate to the material and then also see themselves represented in the material. So we did that in different ways, like changing up the names of people and examples. In the grammar exercises, making sure that like all the doctors that were referenced weren't men. I mean, it was just basic stuff like that was still around 10 years ago. And the reason why is, it takes a lot of time to take someone's book and like adapt it for your own. But the times have caught up, I think, in a lot of, at least for that specific discipline. And so this is another research framework. So this was created by these three researchers down below, Clinton, Lizell, Roberts, Cruz, and Watts. And they created this. So initially, like I said, people, when they were looking at OER research, they were looking at it through the lens of how much cost savings was like impacting students. And they introduced this framework a couple of years ago to include social justice in the way that we look at OER, and then also suggesting that we do more to assess the engagement of students who are using OER. So this is just a really cool like recent change. And then also I have in here, so this is a whole entire book. And so if you access it through this QR code, it's like 300 pages long, and it's all about using open educational resources to promote social justice. So I feel like I'm going too long, so I'm going to start speeding up. So, what I have here is this is the sample framework for evaluating OER. And it was created by the the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges. And it looks at its inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-racism. So the IDEA audit framework. So it's like these different evaluation criteria that you can use as you're looking at OER that you might want to use in your classroom. And then it has examples of how you could enhance the inclusivity of it. So one way that you can do that is through modifying, like say you found an OER and you think that the content is pretty good, but you want to maybe like adapt it. One way that you can do that, that the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges mentions, is by changing up the illustrations and photos within an OER so that they can be more widely representative of the students who are using the material. Other ways you can do that are by changing the names of people in your OER. So like, for example, with the English OER that we changed the names to like include other ethnicities, other nationalities of people. So that way, like the students didn't feel like the text wasn't just about people, you know, who were not like them. And then here we have also within the audit framework, this is the inclusion of gender inclusive language and use of pronouns. And I'm going to hand this over to Sammi because she is the one who found this amazing diagram.
So today I'm going to just briefly talk about gender inclusive language and use of pronouns. And I want to talk about the genderbread person from itspronouncedmetrosexual.com. The genderbread person is important because they go over the different parts of a person: gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and attraction. And each part is important when a person is thinking about who they are and who they want to represent themselves as. And Jennifer, if you can go to the next slide. I made it 3 slides instead of just one, just so that it was a little more spread out. So as someone who identifies as a woman, when I'm reading a text and there are only male pronouns in that text, he and him, I become extremely discouraged by that text, especially when it's about like the profession that I've chosen for myself. And then as a member of the LGBTQ community, when I'm reading a text and they only use he or she pronouns and the text reads in a binary language in terms of gender, I'm discouraged for my peers, for my other LGBTQ community members. And also personally, I like to mentally correct everything that I read, which makes it difficult, and it takes a while because like it could be very like all the time they're just going he or she, and I'm like, but why not just use gender neutral pronouns in this text? With that in mind, as you can see, there are a lot of different pronouns here. And this isn't even a fully comprehensive list. Therefore, when creating content, we need to think about how to make something that reads as culturally inclusive to all audiences. Can you go to the next slide? And as you can see, this like bright green star, they, them are the most inclusive pronouns today. Of course, that can change, but right now it's they, them. Those are the most inclusive. And I know it can be hard to change what you're used to using. But it's important to ensure that you're being inclusive to everyone that may read your text. Personally, I do this by practicing in my everyday language. If I accidentally assign pronouns to someone that I don't know and I haven't asked their pronouns before, I make sure to correct myself, even if I'm just talking in my own head or if I'm just talking with one other person, and I still try to use that as like, just try, if you correct yourself in your everyday language, it'll be easier to correct yourself when you're creating content as well. So that's everything from me, and I'll hand it back.
Thank you, Sammi. You did such a much better job than I ever would have on that slide. All right. So other ways that you can make your OER material more inclusive would be to include historic referencing discipline contributors with backgrounds that are similar to those of students can help validate them and affirm the student as student scholars, and it invites them into the academic conversation. And then also including referenced papers and data from diverse authors, research and organizations. It's another way that you can validate and affirm underrepresented student populations. And then also thinking along the same lines, ways to create material that are more inclusive would be including diverse and relatable examples for students, but also to avoid stereotypes. So this could be done on a chapter or a section basis in the resource as well as holistically. Other ways you can reference people groups, populations, categories, conditions, and disabilities. You should use appropriate verbiage and definitely don't be derogatory. And if you don't know if you're being derogatory, ask someone for help. And then keywords and glossary terms should ensure that diverse topics and terms are appropriately represented in sections. And then this is just another book. This is another resource, and it's A People's History of Structural Racism in Academia. And this book is really cool. It pretty much goes through a bunch of different disciplines and analyzes how they have been historically racist. And so knowing that is helpful. Also, it can be validating if you went through academia like 20 years ago or more. And I'm going to hand it over to John.
Great, thank you. And thinking about the life cycle of OER and touching on something that Jennifer just said about metadata representation, looking at the effort that goes into finding OER, adapting OER, developing OER, after all of that work, part of the natural life cycle of these resources is we want to make them findable. We want to make them discoverable and useful and accessible to the communities that we hope to serve through the development of these resources. So next slide. And to have to make it discoverable to an inclusive group of potential learners or users, we need to be inclusive in our planning for the discoverability. And I just want to acknowledge right here my use of artificial intelligence in the development of this content, because although I have some background and expertise in discoverability, I don't have a deep background or expertise in culturally inclusive discoverability. So here is a text that over here on the right that I use to interface with ChatGPT and a subscription AI service called Cite to get sort of a lay of the land and an overview of resources, vocabularies, experts working in this area. And one of the things I'll note right away, and it's given here, is that the OER primer that Jennifer and Sammi have developed that is available as a library guide through the library's website actually already has most of the resources and identifies most of the scholars and groups that are working in this area. So next slide, which is a testament to how comprehensive that guide is. But I apologize, everyone else generated QR codes for their resources and I have links. But one resource that came up, and it's available from the OER primer, both of the AI chatbots that I worked with to develop this content, reference this document, and when I did search engine searches, things like Google, other search engines, this resource came up multiple times, enhancing inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in open educational resources from the Pressbooks site at the University of South Queensland. So definitely a resource that we keep coming across when we talk about this, when we work in this area, and we just want to highlight it for everyone who is here and will see the video. And next slide. And given that this is sort of a high-level introductory presentation of these concepts, one of the things I really wanted to do was frame it in kind of digestible terms. And so although we could dig much more deeply into each of these topics, that I'm going to be talking about in the next couple of minutes, framing it as a set of general recommendations as we want to prepare to be culturally inclusive in the development of metadata and descriptions of our OER so that they'll be discoverable and useful by the broadest number of potential learners. For me, it came down to four things. We want to include, we want to credit, and we want to reflect and connect as we develop this metadata and aim for discoverability. So next slide. And what we mean by include is very similar to what's been said already in terms of the development of the content of the open educational resources. That likewise, and this comes back to what Jennifer said a minute ago, when you are developing metadata to describe this content, there are vocabularies, there are terms, there are keywords that may commonly be applied to describe certain types of educational objects, books, texts, videos, etc. But to be as inclusive in the development of those descriptors as possible, we should also, in addition to working with communities to develop that content, we want to work with the communities who we hope to reach with these resources in defining what are the keywords, what are the metadata. So think about the user groups, the learner groups, the communities that you're hoping will use these resources and work with them to find out where do they go for OER? What kinds of search terms would they use? What are the culturally relevant keywords that are going to help connect them and other communities that maybe we have only indirectly or haven't had a chance to work with to discover these resources, right? So the learners themselves, work with other educators, include scholars in the field, and community members of specific communities that you're hoping to target with an OER or other resource that you might be developing, in order to make sure that again, the terms that they're going to be thinking of when they're looking for things are included in the metadata and the descriptive information for the resources that we create. And next slide. And likewise, and the OER book that I referenced a moment ago makes this point at several points. They have a chapter on metadata development and description, and stating that, you know, all contributions, if we want to be as inclusive as possible, all contributions to the development of that content should be acknowledged in the metadata, in the citation, in the descriptions of authors, creators, contributors. So we want to make sure to know all of the authors, all of the editors, the reviewers and the peer reviewers and people who may have translated content for us should receive credit for that work and the effort that they've contributed within the metadata and the descriptive information that we provide to make these resources discoverable. And again, this is something we've presented on at multiple points, so we won't go into detail about licensing, but especially if you are adapting content from other resources, be sure to include relevant licensing information that may vary across the different contributions that people have made. Next slide. We also want to evaluate and adapt metadata resources. For example, Library of Congress keywords, subject headings can be famously controversial in terms of the way that certain populations are described, the way that certain groups have been described over time using these subject headings and using these terminologies. So where appropriate, again, and in consultation with the communities that we are hoping to reach with these documents and who are represented within the documents, we want to be sure to change things as necessary, right, as we are developing keywords and descriptors to be inclusive and appropriate. If we are using a controversial term, to provide context to explain why that term is still relevant or what exactly is the controversy and why it may apply to the particular resource or the document. If we can find controlled vocabularies that are more inclusive, and there are some alternatives out there to using Library of Congress subject headings, certainly use that. And again, as noted before, be inclusive, involve community members in creation of metadata. And there's a lot of these suggestions are available in this publication from OCLC on reimagining descriptive workflows by Rachel Frick and Marilee Profit. And so again, a link there is provided to that document that's freely accessible from the internet. And next slide. And then finally, connection. So it's great to work on a document, to work on a resource, and to make it available on your personal website or your department or your project website. But it's always useful to keep in mind, too, that repositories exist to distribute OER to maximize their discoverability through search engines, places like Google, MOOCs, other kinds of resources. And so, again, Pressbooks, the New Mexico OER Consortium uses Pressbooks to publish. Merlot is a repository that we've mentioned in several of these presentations, as well as the OER Commons. So in addition to, if it's relevant, having your copy available from your local website, we always encourage you to share your content, to share the resources you create through these more federated targeted repositories that are going to make it available to a very broad group and very discoverable. And again, for developing metadata across contexts, we have a couple of recommendations here relevant to how we can apply structured metadata schema or improve the search engine optimization, so that it's not just a matter of what kinds of keywords we use, but titles, subjects, authors, how we can combine these in ways that are going to be most discoverable by search engines. And next slide, I think that's me. Great, thank you.
Thank you. That was so good. So now we're going to shift gears. Another way to be inclusive of your students is to include open pedagogy. And so this is just a quick little overview of open pedagogy. We're going to have a longer session later on in the workshop series. But so open pedagogy is when students are creators of information and course content. The one desired outcome is experiential learning, where students can demonstrate their understanding through creating OER. So when you use open pedagogy in your classroom, you're inviting your students to be part of the teaching process. They are participating in the co-creation of knowledge. And so that helps to raise the stakes for students. Open pedagogy, also like the output of it can be considered a renewable assignment. And so it's an assignment that can, like, the output can be used beyond the life of the classroom. And so that also helps to kind of like make students accountable for this thing that is, not going to be an assignment that they get back. And like me, when I was a student, I was so bad. I would get back my feedback from my teacher and I would crumple it up and throw it in the trash. Those are called literally disposable assignments. But so we also have an open pedagogy library guide that you can check out. And this has some sample assignments and links to different resources. If you would like to try open pedagogy in your own classroom. And then here's also the open pedagogy student toolkit. So this is another good resource that you can use if you would like to try out open pedagogy with your students. Like, different ways that I've seen people do this are, like, students might help create a textbook. They might be like an outcome of the course might be that a student creates like a polished chapter. Other ways that I've seen teachers do this are like with having students create Wikipedia entries or revising a Wikipedia entry. And Wikipedia also has, like, no, it's not Wikipedia, it's a different organization affiliated with it, but they have lots of help and content for you to have a Wikipedia assignment for your students. And then this is a really cool website, the Open Pedagogy Notebook. And so it was created by these two authors, Robin DeRosa and Rajiv Jangiani, and they have done a lot with open pedagogy, and this whole website has so many new, like, innovative things that you can try out with your students. But we'll have a longer session on this too, but I just wanted to include this because it is definitely a way that you can include your students and their experiences, their interpretations, their analysis in like the outcomes of the class, the output of the OER as well. So does anybody have questions for us in the audience?
I guess I have a question. I teach book arts, and book arts often becomes very personal. People bring all kinds of experiences to a book arts project. That's the nature of it. So I'm just wondering, as a teacher, where I've had those, it's not a situation, it is the learning that we want in the classroom. And I would have people from all different backgrounds in there. What is the best place for teachers to learn how to support those conversations, how to listen and facilitate dialogue in that classroom?
Okay. So this is just like referencing cultural inclusivity in general.
Culture, gender, race, you name it. I mean, I've had students. I've been fortunate because most of the people in art in general are fairly open-minded people. And so we've also had political discussions. People do books about, the politics of past elections as well. And so I have felt like some of the courses I've taken at UNM in education were really helpful for me to manage those conversations in my art classes. But I just wondered if all of you have suggestions for what is a good resource to read about for how to facilitate and support difficult or challenging conversations around this topic in a classroom.
Personally don't have a resource, but I do have like strategies that I've used. And so
Hear those, yeah.
in the classroom, like what I tried to do was to just create like a safe environment where students felt comfortable sharing their experiences. And so, I mean, that means like as a moderator, that like seeming like a fair person who isn't, judging. I think that also like the way that you sort of create the classroom dynamic, even down to like the way that you grade their papers. Like if you're not grading in a punitive way, it has a positive impact. Like I don't have research to support this. I just have my experience. Like if the students don't feel judged, either during classroom conversations or in the way that you're like evaluating their work, they'll feel more open to express themselves. I think also, yeah, creating a safe environment. And so that might mean having conversations with students who are like maybe not adhering to the ground rules. Also having ground rules can be helpful. Maybe having like also a contract, some sort of a contract that students sign in the beginning in terms of like the code of conduct and being open. That could help. And it could be something to fall back on if the students stray from that. Those are just some ideas that I have, though. I don't know if anyone else has ideas.
I was going to pop one of our colleagues' articles into the chat box. Sarah Kostelecki, Lori Townsend, and David Hurley have published on cultural humility, and the article that I'm linking to directly has to do with their article about cultural humility in children's library services. So I don't know that it's a perfect match to the question, but I do think that they outline like the key ideas of cultural humility, which I think can help practitioners be in a good position to sort of anticipate, right? Like what we want to be sensitive about and how we might thoughtfully and carefully facilitate what we're aiming for.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm actually almost done reading it too. It's a good, the ALA, the short, the little version of it, or
So this is just an article, like this is a
okay.
snippet. The colleagues I mentioned are fairly renowned authors on cultural humility. This one is a smaller piece, but yeah, they've got a great ALA. I think what Jennifer is referring to is like their 50-ish page booklet kind of thing, but then they've also published or edited a bigger piece. So I've really valued an orientation that sort of can help us think about it in practice. I think sometimes it feels a little abstract.
Thank you, Olivia. Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're good unless anybody has any questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, John and Olivia and Sammi, for contributing to this